wow in two respects. First, for the crowd here today. As I drove out here today in the rain, I thought, boy, we're going to be lucky to fill this place. So I know you didn't come to hear me. And Cokie, you packed this place. So second wow is the introduction. Bob, I appreciate it so much, and much of it I feel is undeserved. There's so many people that have given blood, sweat, and tears to this place, and it's always a pleasure. Our 23rd convocation, it's great. We wanted it to be a tradition when we kicked it off in 1993, and it has become that, and it does my heart good to see you all here. And again, I appreciate so much the support of the faculty. You don't have to come, but you're here, and I appreciate that. I appreciate the continuing efforts of the Board of Governors and certainly Dr. Vartabedian and his staff to sponsor these convocations, and I commend the effort and all the work that Jerry Pickman and his staff put into this. I want to extend a special welcome to the students that are here today, both the high school students and the college students. When we started this, and going back to my college days and hearing Robert Kennedy Jr. just before his assassination, I know what that meant to me, and this is an experience that I wanted you all to have. That's very important to me, and it's nice to be able to bring the community in to hear high-profile speakers as well. And we have another one here today. And for those of you who have been here before, and I see many familiar faces that have, welcome back. And I know we have something to look forward to today. This is a convocation on critical issues, and these are trying times. Some may say that they are very tough times before us as a nation. But it is not as though, as a country, we have not gone through tough times before. We are experiencing one of the, if not the, most extraordinary presidential election seasons of our lifetime. The election of our next president entails a host of critical issues. As you may have heard me say before, it has never been our intent to politicize these convocations, particularly during election year, by endorsing or favoring one candidate or one party over another. Instead, we try to bring political balance to these convocations overall and insight into the critical issues we face. Arthur Schlesinger, Jr., historian, advisor to President John F. Kennedy, and two-time Pulitzer Prize-winning author, was our very first convocation speaker on October 11, 1993. His topic was the disuniting of America. Dr. Schlesinger believed our country was facing, in 1993, a potentially serious disunification threat at that time. He warned that ethnic rivalry and conflict was wrecking other countries, and we needed to prevent it from happening in our country. His point was that separate cultures or groups of individuals who define themselves by their ancestors or different cultures were beginning to divide our nation. He implored us during that convocation address from this very podium to take steps to stop the fragmentation and to unite as one people, one culture. He said we should be, regardless of our ancestry, Americans, united by a common culture and ideals. As we look around our country today, has Dr. Schlesinger's warning become a reality? Was he right? Our third convocation speaker in 1996 was the renowned author, historian, and Pulitzer Prize winner David Mccullough. He spoke to us from his perspective of history being a source of strength. He said that during trying times, we can look to the past to see how our country overcame many challenges and draw strength and confidence that we can overcome our current challenges. I got to watch the Cronkite series last night, the first and third segment, first time I had seen the Martin Luther King segment. absolutely tremendous. And if you have not seen it, I hope you will. What Dr. Vardabedian and the others have done is truly remarkable. But during the Cronkite segment, the first segment, there was a caller that called in to the Larry King show right after, a year after 9/11, which we just celebrated, if you want to call it celebration, at least a remembrance this past Sunday after 15 years. The caller asked this: Mr. Cronkite, what can we as a country do to comfort ourselves in this time, in such a time of sorrow and anxiety? And to echo basically what David Mccullough said, his response was this: our comfort is in our history. And we can look at our history for comfort today. So as we consider anew our challenges and where we are as a society and country today, our speaker brings her own unique perspectives on the 2016 presidential election. Whether we call ourselves Republicans, Democrats, Libertarians, Green Partiers, or Independents, we should be, first and foremost, Americans. Mary, Martha, Corinne, Morrison, Claiborne, Boggs, Roberts was born and raised in New Orleans. I think it's that Southern stuff, as my wife would say. She was from Mississippi, or is from Mississippi. You know her as Cokie Roberts, American journalist, author, news analyst, and political commentator for National Public Radio and ABC News. She was named Cokie by her brother Tommy, who could not pronounce Corinne. She is the daughter of ambassador and longtime Democratic Louisiana Congresswoman Lindy Boggs and Hale Boggs, also a Democratic congressman from Louisiana, who was a majority leader in the U.S. House of Representatives and a member of the Warren Commission. She attended the Academy of Sacred Heart, an all-girls school in New Orleans, before graduating from the Stonebridge School, an all-girls school outside of Washington, D.C. in 1960. She then attended Wellesley College, where she received a BA in political science in 1964. She has served as a senior news analyst for National Public Radio, where she has been a congressional correspondent for more than 10 years. If you watched the national news last night, every network carried Cokie's statement on National Public Radio yesterday morning about the election. She was a contributor for PBS television news program, the McNeil-Lear News Hour. Her coverage of the Iran-Contra affair for that program won her an award for diplomatic reporting in 1988. Prior to joining NPR, she was a reporter for CBS News in Athens, Greece. She joined ABC News in 1988. You have seen her as a regular political commentator for ABC, serving as an on-air analyst for the network. From 1996 to 2002, she co-anchored the ABC News Sunday morning broadcast This Week with Sam Donaldson and Cokie Roberts, while serving as the chief congressional analyst for ABC News. Some of you may recall that Sam Donaldson, her colleague at that time, was our 2007 convocation speaker. In her more than 40 years in broadcasting, she has won countless awards, including 3 Emmys. In 2000, she was the recipient of the Cronkite Award at Arizona State University, presented to her by Walter Cronkite himself. She has been inducted into the Broadcasting and Cable Hall of Fame and was cited by the American Women in Radio and Television as one of the 50 greatest women in the history of broadcasting. She holds more than 20 honorary degrees, serves on the boards of a number of nonprofit institutions, and on the President's Commission on Service and Civic Participation. The Library of Congress named her a living legend, one of the very few Americans to have attained that honor. She has authored a number of books, including Capital Dames, The Civil War, and The Women of Washington, 1948 to 1968, published last year. She is married to Stephen Roberts, a professor and fellow journalist. They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary last Saturday. They currently reside in Bethesda, Maryland. They have 2 children and 6 grandchildren. Today, she favors us with her presence. Would you please join me in extending a warm Missouri welcome to one of America's most familiar faces, Cokie Roberts.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dan. And now you know more about me than my mother did. What a treat to be here on this very beautiful campus. I was here yesterday, so I saw it without the rain. And it is spectacular. And I spent some time this morning with the student leaders, and they were great. They asked wonderful questions and were very engaged and engaging. So it's hope for the future. It's also lovely to be with such dedicated people as your president, Vartabedian, and Dan Boulware, who's done so much work for this campus and for this series. I noticed that you said, one of your past speakers was Arthur Schlesinger, very serious person, and one was Sam Donaldson. There you go. And Colin Powell, James Carville, they all have a sense of humor. I think that's the common thread, which is always a good thing. I also was delighted to be in this arena to cheer on the Griffins. I understand that the basketball team won the conference championship. That would be the women's basketball team. Thank goodness for Title IX. That way you get some championships. But I did kind of go back to look at the Griffin. I have a stuffed one in my hotel room, so I'll take it home. But and the symbolism is the strength of the lion and the majesty of the eagle. And I tried in some way and the guardian of the treasure, I tried in some way to connect it to this year's election and failed. I just, came up short. We could use the Griffin. I'd vote for him. We could also use Walter Cronkite. He was known as the most trusted man in America. Now, can you imagine today any journalist being considered the most trusted person in America? No. I mean, we're just nowhere near that in our society today, and we're not near that with politicians either. We have this wonderful rosy glow over Harry Truman, and of course David Mccullough, one of your former speakers and a good friend of mine, was so instrumental in introducing us to the real Harry Truman in his wonderful biography. But I was a kid when Harry Truman was president, and we've already established that I've been married 50 years, so you've got some sense of my age. And I remember the jokes about Harry Truman and his Hawaiian shirts and how nobody thought he was up to the presidency and how furious the country was when he fired General MacArthur. And I remember General MacArthur coming to a joint meeting of Congress and everybody cheering for him and denigrating the president. So, we tend to be kinder to our politicians in retrospect than in prospect. But that is kind of where we are right now. We are in a prospect where we are not being at all welcoming to our candidates for president. In fact, they have the highest negative ratings of any candidates in our history since we started measuring that. Now, if we had measured it when Andrew Jackson was running for president, it might have been rough, but here we are, you know, we will make history because we will probably either elect the first woman president or the first person not to have served in government or been a general, which of course is government service. So that is, you know, history making all on its own. I was reflecting last night when I watched Dr. Vartabedian's wonderful multimedia shows on Walter Cronkite, the King and Cronkite, and then just Cronkite, and came up with many of the same thoughts that Dan has expressed. But one of the other quotations from Cronkite that I noticed that stood out to me was him saying, "We are all humans together." Well, not so much right now in the view of a lot of Americans, you know, despite the fact of that. I mean, if you question it, just go to a graveyard, you know, but or a newborn nursery. But it has not been the operating principle in our political world, either here at home or abroad, that we are all humans together. And that is where we are today. I thought it was so interesting, Dan, that you said about Schlesinger and disunifying America, because it has, since 1993, become a far more bleak picture. I'm asked all the time, is this the most partisan time ever, the most polarized time ever in our history? I'm always hoping that they think that I'm asked this more as a person who writes history books rather than as a person who's covered it all, right? And of course, it's not the worst time ever. I mean, first of all, they're not shooting each other. This is a plus. You know, they used to shoot each other all the time. Metal detectors are definitely an improvement. But seriously, you know about the Burr-Hamilton duel, but that was just the most famous of them. They happened constantly. The term of art was call each other out on the floor of the House of Representatives, and then they'd go out to Bladensburg outside of Washington where there was a dueling ground, and then they'd murder each other over political speech. And by the way, Burr-Hamilton, think of it. Aaron Burr was the sitting vice president of the United States when he murdered his political enemy over political speech. Now, our most recent vice president had a problem with a gun, but I don't think that I don't think it had to do with political speech. In fact, at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, where I never go, but I watch it on TV because it's so much more pleasant, the president this year was making a joke about Joe Biden, and he says, "Oh, there's Joe Biden over there. He's, my good friend. I love Joe. Never shot anybody in the face." And so, no, this is not our most partisan and polarized time ever. That time was the time before the Civil War, when they were shooting each other and doing worse. And it led to war. And we lost 500,000 American lives because the politicians could not get their act together to come to the place they needed to come to get to emancipation without killing hundreds of thousands of Americans. So it was the great failure of the American experiment. Few places saw it worse than Missouri, by the way, in terms of brother versus brother. And it was the horrendous moment in our history that showed what happens when politics fails. And it's certainly not something we would ever want to repeat. Thank God we do not have an overriding moral issue like slavery. There is no issue like slavery. Nothing could compare to it. But did we have something as or close to as forceful and a prospect before us to divide people? I don't know where we'd be given how partisan and polarized we are today, because it's not the worst, but it's really bad. You have more Democrats identifying themselves as liberals and more Republicans identifying themselves as conservatives than in any earlier year since polling began. You have, partly for that reason, the plurality of voters identifying themselves as independents. But of course, that's not reflected in the political world, where, as the chairman of the Republican National Committee is fond of saying, this is a binary decision. It's not, some abstract, as he would say, Trump or no Trump. Your choice is Trump or Clinton. So the fact that Democrats see themselves as liberals and Republicans as conservatives, you are in a position where that's where you have to go, and it's to the extremes in both parties. And it is very difficult for people in those extremes to look toward the center and see any kind of compromise possible or any kind of moving together as all humans as possible. Now, that's, by the way, why this election is so close. I always thought it would be close because and I thought it would be close even before Hillary Clinton's fainting fit on Sunday. In the olden days, when I was a little girl growing up Catholic, we all carried smelling salts. She should carry smelling salts around. Because you couldn't eat after midnight, before communion, and so there were droppers all over church, and so we had these little smelling salts that we carried in our dainty little bags, and it would be a good idea. By the way, having grown up in that in that life and still being very much a very serious Catholic myself, my husband of 50 years is Jewish. And they said it would never last. But it was always going to be a close race because the country is deeply divided. And so even though things happen in the course of the campaign that people do swing back and forth to some degree and look at and say they don't like. There's not much they say they like. They don't like, by and large, majorities don't like Trump talking about banning Muslims or calling Mexican racist. They don't like, certainly, Hillary Clinton talking about baskets of deplorables and seeming, making both sides seem very intolerant. It is one of those things that you see both sides putting the ads up, emphasizing the candidate saying the other candidate. I mean, it's really quite remarkable. Each candidate runs the other candidate in their ads because they think that is the way to get elected. And it is true that the dislike is large, huge, or as Bernie Sanders would say, huge. But as I say, it's close because the country is divided and it's preset, and people are there are very few people in the middle or undecided enough to be swayed. You'd never know that, of course, by the political ads on TV, and boy, are you in, ground zero for a lot of that. The TV stations make out like bandits, and it is a year that everybody is putting on all these ads, even though Jeb Bush spent $150 million on television advertising and got 2% of the vote. So it's something of a cautionary tale. But still, the TV stations can be grateful that no one has learned that lesson. The irony is that with all of this negativity, people say they don't like this division and that like the politicians to get something done, and that's part of why they're angry, is because the politicians aren't doing anything. Now, different people are angry for different reasons, and there are different sections of the electorate who are concerned about different things. But there is an overall sense of congressional inaction and ineptitude that has fueled a lot of what people are trying to figure out how to fix. The congressional approval rating hovers around 15%. John McCain always says it's basically paid staff and blood relatives who approve of Congress. And look at it right now. I mean, there are scientists coming before the Congress and saying, we need funding for the Zika virus. It is spreading in our country, and they can't get it together to even do that, much less keep the government going. So there's a reason to feel that this is not a time when you want to reward the people who are there, and a reason that a lot of people feel frustrated at least and angry at most about what's going on. And it wasn't always like this, and a lot of us are old enough to remember that or have read enough history to remember that. You have talked about Thomas Eagleton and the pool, but he was a member of the Senate who constantly reached across the aisle and got things done and met with other people. And that's the way it always was for most of our history, where people would not only cross the aisle to vote, because that was the way you got something accomplished, but they'd cross the aisle to socialize and be friendly and know each other. I had the great honor a couple of years ago of being asked to be one of the eulogists at Betty Ford's funeral. Now, I would have been terrified, frankly, to speak about such a remarkable woman, except for that Mrs. Ford had told me exactly what she wanted me to say. So it made it a whole lot easier. And she had been there for my last interview with President Ford. And he said to me then, he said, Cokie, I don't understand what's going on in Washington. And that was long before it got anywhere near as bad as it is now. And he said, when I was minority leader of the House of Representatives and your father was majority leader, we used to get in a cab together, which was an exaggeration. They did have drivers. But he said, we'd get in a cab together and we'd go downtown to someplace like the Press Club, and we'd say, okay, what are we going to argue about? And he said, look, it was a genuine debate. We disagreed. We disagreed about means to an end, and it was partisan. For heaven's sakes, we were the leaders of our parties in the House of Representatives. But then we'd get back in the cab and be best friends. And that's absolutely true. And that was true all through the Congress. And in fact, my father was lost in a plane in Alaska, and the Fords were there every night at the house to support my mother and my family. None of that is true anymore. They barely know each other's names in their own parties, much less across the aisle. So there's none of that sort of fundamental fellowship that gets people together and gets something done. And it's one of the main reasons for this total dysfunction. And there's some others. So one is the families. The families don't move to Washington anymore. And there are a variety of reasons for that. There's been kind of an organized campaign of portraying Washington as the evil, awful place, sort of Sodom on the Potomac. I've never seen the action if it's true, but and that if you move your family there, they will somehow go native. And so politicians are afraid to do that, and so they keep the families at home, and people don't know each other. Some of them live in their offices, which I fundamentally find disgusting. And and also, by the way, as a taxpayer, don't much want to pay their rent. But the families don't know each other. They don't have that sort of fundamental sense of camaraderie, and sense that the other person with whom you disagree, and that disagreement can be very valid, but that person is not an evil person with bad motives. That person is there to serve just like you are there to serve. When I was growing up, one of my best friends, and still a good friend, was Libby Miller. My father was a liberal Democrat from Louisiana, oxymoron, I know, and now really. And her father was a conservative Republican from upstate New York, which is also becoming an oxymoron. Bill Miller was his name. He was chairman of the Republican National Committee, went on to run as Barry Goldwater's running mate. We were, best friends as kids, and saw each other all the time. It's very hard to demonize someone whose child is playing Clue in your basement. And that is the way it was. And that is gone, completely gone. Another reason that this polarization is so intense is that we live in the permanent campaign. So everybody's running all the time. And that means fundraising all the time. And in order to fundraise, you really do speak to the extremes, because they have scorecards and they have all, reports. They put up amendments on bills just for the purpose of getting a vote on it to raise money around it. And so you have enormous difficulty in getting anything done because of that. Then you have the media. And we are definitely unindicted co-conspirators in this problem, because not only do you have the organizations that are dedicated to one side or another, whether it be Fox or MSNBC or talk radio or the internet, but even in mainstream media, we tend to give our microphones or get our quotations from the loudest shouters. And the sort of reasonable, quiet people are not considered good broadcasting. And so you don't hear from them as much. Of course, the problem with the people who are dedicated to one side or another is that they become enormous echo chambers. And so you don't hear anything except from people you already agree with. And not only does each side have its own opinions, but they've now got their own facts. So that there's, Daniel Patrick Moynihan used to say, everybody's entitled to his own opinion, not entitled to his own facts. Well, that's out the window. Everybody now decides that facts aren't facts, and what they believe to be facts are facts, whether they're facts or not. And that completely also guides the political discourse on both sides. And then finally, one of the other great contributors to this polarization is us, is the American people. And one thing has happened that we've done ourselves, and the other is a political sort of corollary. And one is what they call the great sort. Sociologists call it this, where we tend to move to where people like us are. And so people, who are living in a blue state who are red will move to a red state to be with more like-minded people and vice versa. And so that sort of, again, exacerbates the differences. And then that is vastly added to by the drawing of district lines, so that congressional districts are created so that whichever party has the incumbency is completely safe in that district. And the only way you can get in trouble is to not toe the party line, to not be orthodox enough. Because if you're not orthodox enough, if you're not to the left enough as a Democrat, to the right enough as a Republican, you will get a challenge in the primary, and that's the only way you can be defeated, because the districts are so safe that it's almost impossible to get defeated in a general election. And that, of course, makes it really almost impossible to ever compromise and govern. I had the very interesting experience the last year that President Bush was in office, President George W. Bush was in office, where out of the blue, I got this call from the White House press secretary, Dana Perino, which surprised me. I didn't know her, I just saw her on TV. And she said, Cokie, the president wants to know if you would like to ride with him from the White House out to Andrews Air Force Base when he goes to meet the Pope. And I said, okay. I'll see if I can clear my schedule. And so I got to the White House, and it was totally cool, I have to tell you. It was, the president and Mrs. Bush and Jenna, and getting the limousine and all that. And I was chosen for this, by the way, because I speak Pope. My mother was the ambassador to the Vatican, a job she took at age 81. Actually, it was a wonderful story. She was, 81 years old, and our family just thought it was wonderful that she would have this capstone on a career in public service and serve both her country and her church. And off she goes to Rome, and we were thrilled about that because it meant we got to go to Rome all the time. And then what happened in this country happened. And my mother found herself representing Bill Clinton to the Pope. Now, think of it, it was the toughest job in the diplomatic service, but if anybody could do it, Mama could. But and President Clinton has since said to me, the Pope liked me, Cokie, and I'm sure that's true. But Mama then went home to her home on Bourbon Street in New Orleans, and I mean on Bourbon Street. I mean, she lived right smack dab in the middle of all of the honky-tonk on Bourbon Street. When my kids were small, we'd walk past the strippers and the other neighbors, and I'd say, through the woods and over the hills to grandmother's house we go. And then she moved from Bourbon Street to the Vatican, and I told her that the costumes hadn't changed. It was still men in dresses. So as so as the president and I were riding out to greet a man in a dress, he wanted to talk to me about why he was breaking precedent to go greet the Pope, that normally the head of state comes to the White House and the president and first lady greet them there. You've seen that picture a million times, the limousine pulling up under the portico, president and first lady on the steps. But he said he wanted to do this as a gesture of respect and to show his sense of the Pope's moral authority, not only in the world, but in this country. And so we started talking about that, and we were talking about the church in America. And that got us to the question of immigration, because the bishops have been very active in trying to promote his immigration bill. And he said to me, and I am now quoting directly, he said, "Cokie, I tried and tried and tried to get my party to do the right thing on immigration, and I couldn't do it because of the way district lines are drawn." And Republicans were just too afraid to do anything on that issue because of getting challenged in a primary election. So, you know, it's something that he has been looking at, and the Republican Party has been looking at for a good while, and it underlines another one of our great divisions, which are demographic. And we have huge demographic divides. We see it reflected in the current polls. Over the weekend, ABC did its most recent poll, and Hillary Clinton was polling at 75% among non-whites, all non-whites together. It's about 95% among African Americans. Trump is doing slightly less well with whites than Romney did in 2012, and that's mainly because of college-educated white women, and I'll come back around to them later. But Romney's 20-point lead, it's actually slightly more than 20-point lead with the white vote, was a tiny bit larger than Ronald Reagan's was in 1980, and Romney won the independents. And in former days, those two numbers would mean you were elected president of the United States. And it did mean it with Reagan in 1980, when 89% of the electorate was white. In 2012, 72% of the electorate was white, and it is dropping now. And that is a problem that Republicans are looking at, and many of them well aware of. When I was a kid growing up, African Americans were Republicans. It was the party of Lincoln. And it was, you looked at a Republican convention, and the delegates from my home state of Louisiana were black. And it started to change a little bit with Roosevelt. And then with Kennedy, Martin Luther King Sr. was a very prominent Republican. But then when John Kennedy called Martin Luther King Jr. when he was in jail, called Coretta King when Martin Luther King Jr. was in jail, Daddy King, as he was known, said, well, okay, I guess I have to support him, even though he's a Democrat and a Catholic. But that chipped away more, and then the big change came with the Civil Rights era and the Civil Rights Bills of 64 and 65, when even though more percentage-wise Republicans voted for those bills in Congress than Democrats did, Republicans started forming in the South, taking over the old segregationist Dixiecrats, and African Americans started feeling and hearing that they were unwelcome in the Republican Party and went off the party in huge numbers and have stayed off ever since. Hispanics had been up for grabs. I did a story in the 1980s when Reagan was president in California at a naturalization ceremony. And everybody taking the oath was Hispanic or Asian. And they came out of the stadium where they were, and there were voter registration tables set up, and almost every single solitary one of them went to the Republican table and registered as a Republican. We said, why? Why are you doing that? Well, because the Republicans are the party of making it. I came to this country to make it. The Democrats are a bunch of losers. And that was true until Pete Wilson, the governor, who was a Republican, a moderate Republican, supported what was known as Proposition 187, which was aimed at illegal immigrants, but immigrants heard it as immigrants, and Hispanics and Asians went off the Republican Party in California 180. And that's what turned the state deep blue. And they are not back. And they are hearing that, even though on some economic issues and some social issues, many people in the Hispanic community are more closely aligned with the Republican Party. Immigration is a gateway issue. It's a question of whether you feel welcome or not, whether people make you feel like you are part of that America that Dan was quoting Arthur Schlesinger is talking about. So that's a big problem. Young people also have gone off the Republican Party, and that is about cultural issues, particularly issues relating to gay people. And so it's hard to get that back, which is why Romney, and those are the reasons Romney lost in 2012, despite having won the white vote and the independent vote. And the Republicans did, after that election, what they called an autopsy. And they said the way for us to have a nationwide winning majority requires outreach to especially the Hispanic community and immigration reform. And of course, that didn't happen. And instead, where we are is with Donald Trump talking about building a wall. And he's gone by going in the opposite direction from where the party had said they needed to go. He's excited another group of people. And it is essentially white people, particularly white men, who feel like their voices are being heard for the first time in a very long time. And that Donald Trump is giving voice to a lot of their concerns and frustrations, both with the government and with the country as a whole. You know, we have lived through and are living through, at this time in our history, a period that I think is equivalent to the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century. And you think about that time, how incredibly disruptive it was in people's lives. You had to move off the farm and into the city, sometimes had to move across the ocean. And everybody's roles were disrupted. It used to be before that time that it was what you made that was of value, particularly for women in home manufacture. But then it became the hours that you put in that was what mattered. And you were one of many people just standing there. Your particular work was not of any particular import. And it was an incredibly disruptive time, both economically and culturally, and a time that the world had to get through. And we're in the same kind of thing with the technological revolution, where the benefits of the Industrial Revolution are now pretty much dying out. And so no longer can you expect to have, in any country on earth, a good job working for a big manufacturer where you can have a house and a boat and expect your kids to have a better life than you. That world is over. And it doesn't matter who's president of what country. We are living through a time where everything is disrupted. And it's why an institution like this is so incredibly important, by the way, because people can come here and start anew and learn to deal with this new world. There was an announcement recently, Marriott Corporation made this announcement, that they were going to make every towel for every hotel they own all over the world in America. Great, right? So a couple of textile mills in the Carolinas start re-gearing to open up. You know how many people those textile mills will hire to make every towel? Fewer than 200. These are beautiful places, clean as they can be, with machines just going, but no people. And that's the world we're living in. And so it is very difficult to adjust, particularly if you did very well in the way it used to be. And you combine that with cultural changes where you don't recognize a lot of things going on in the country around you. And you have people who are feeling that this is not the America that they remember and grew up in, which is the whole impetus behind Make America Great Again, because it is completely understandable that that's the way people would feel. It's also a change election. That's where we are. We very, very seldom elect a third term of one party. We did it in 1988 with George Bush at the end of 2 Reagan terms, and we did it with Franklin Roosevelt reelecting himself. But it is very unusual. We also have about 2/3 of the country saying that the country is going in the wrong direction rather than that it's on the right track. And that's a number that we always look at to see whether the incumbent party is likely to be reelected. Now, in the face of that, you have the President Obama's approval ratings at the moment are higher than they have been. In fact, he said recently, I haven't been this high since I was picking my major. But it's a real question of how that all goes. And I think actually the people who are in the end likely to determine it are those college-educated white women. In the first time since we've done demographic polling, which started in 1980, they are trending Democratic. And that is, we've never seen that before. And so we will see whether that continues. The women's vote as a whole has tended to be more Democratic. And by the way, that has absolutely nothing to do with issues like abortion. Men and women vote exactly the same way on those issues. It has to do with the role of government. And women tend, and this is, tend, not are, tend to be slightly more favorable toward government because they are the people who are on Social Security, Medicare. We wish you men lived that long, you don't. They're the people taking care of the people on Social Security and Medicare. They are the people on food stamps. They are the people running the welfare bureaus, the libraries, the schools. So they have a sense of government as not an evil factor in the society. And so their vote has tended to be more Democratic, but that is driven in large part by non-white and single women. And what we're seeing now is in this polling so far in this election that white, married women, particularly those with college degrees, are trending much more Democratic than they have in the past. But we don't know, again, whether that will be enough for her. So we will see. As we saw on Sunday with the health events, events can make an enormous difference in this election. Any election, but particularly this election where people are so unsettled. Debates can make an enormous difference. And so we're going to just have to live through the next couple of months. I do have to say that I'm worried about attempts at delegitimizing the outcome of talking about the rigged system. Because, in fact, the voting is, despite some oddities here and there, is safe in this country. The places where it does tend to, you can get into a little trouble is with absentee ballots, but very little. And the trouble with that is that it keeps this sense of divide going. And this has been true now for a while. The Democrats did not accept, a lot of Democrats did not accept George Bush as a legitimate president because of the Supreme Court decision. You know, he was our president, but there was this holdout factor. And a lot of Republicans didn't accept Barack Obama as a legitimate president for a variety of reasons, which the birther movement kept going. And if we go into yet another presidency with that sense of part of the country not accepting the President of the United States as our president, I see that as a very, very worrisome thing. But I, like Dan, take heart from, and I wrote it down as well, Dan, take heart from Walter Cronkite's answer when asked, where do we find comfort? Our comfort is our history. And I agree with that. We have survived, and I think we will survive this, and the great American experiment will continue. But it really depends on us, on the voters of America, to make sure that that happens. So thank you very much. It was wonderful to be with you. Thank you. Thank you.